Welcome to the Journal podcast from the Chartered Insurance Institute, where we explore practical and thought-provoking topics from across insurance and beyond. I'm Tim Groves from the CII. Today, we're talking about a new report from the National Emergencies Trust and Lancaster University that looks at the experience of people recovering after floods and a kind of information and support that they receive in those early days and weeks. We look at what the report found, what it means for insurers and claims professionals, and what we as a profession can do better to support customers after major flood events. Joining us on the podcast today, we have Jonathan Clark from the National Emergencies Trust and William Quibell, Head of Claims at Ageas and member of the CII Claims Community Board. Thank you both for joining me on the podcast today. Welcome, Jonathan. Welcome, Will. We'll get straight in with the questions then. So for listeners who may not have seen it yet, what is the Stories After the Storms report and what was it trying to explore?
Well, the Stories After the Storms report is a piece of work between National Emergencies Trust, which is UK's independent emergency response partner, and Lancaster University. And what we were trying to look at was a little bit about how survivors are impacted by major incidents, in this particular case, flood. What we're trying to do is explore a little bit about what and where the need is for those survivors. How can we work together to meet that need? And above all else, what can we learn from this and take forward to give ourselves a chance of doing a better job as we go into the future? Essentially, I think we know support's needed. We know there are societal impacts, and it's that chance to understand it. We also worked with Heather Shepherd from Flooded People UK to get her insights as well. So essentially, the report is developed from those who've been through floods, a mixture of online and face-to-face interviews, and then being compiled by Lancaster University in order that we can produce a report to be shared publicly.
That's great. Thank you. So what is it that actually led to this research being commissioned, and why do you think now necessarily was the right time to do it?
Well, National Emergencies Trust, we've got an unusual position in that we are there and can convene a number of parties, both government, regulators, responders, but we have a particular focus around survivors, looking at those who are impacted by major disaster. We did a previous report called Be the Difference, looking at the impact of the Manchester bomb on those who were there and those who survived it. Most of the work we try to do is what we call risk agnostic, but we do like to look in a little bit of detail at particular impacts on survivors. And I think we felt very strongly that perhaps one of the biggest emergency situations facing all of us is flood. One can only look out of the window and look at the news stories every day. So it seemed to be the right time for us to look at flood and start to understand exactly how that impacted people beyond the insurance networks and trying to get into the communities and understand what was really going on.
That's great. Thank you. So from your perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges that flood survivors face during the recovery?
Probably the simplest way to put it is at one moment you're living in your home and the next moment you're holding a mop and you're trying to deal with something that was completely unexpected. I think if one looks at it from an insurance claims perspective, most people don't anticipate the claims. That's not what you planned for. You hope that you won't ever claim. So perhaps the biggest thing that comes out of the challenge is really the uncertainty that's created after an incident. And flood damage, as we know, it's a big cost. It's very disruptive. So it's having your life turned upside down. I think there's also a lot of shock, a lot of fear. Is it going to happen again? How do we sort this out? There's an awful lot of information that you're going to have to pull together. And it's about how do you actually get sorted? Worries about finance. The costs mount immediately on day one. And also, I think what support's available. So there are a number of challenges that survivors face, but probably the biggest, as I say, is just that uncertainty.
Yeah, if I just add to that, given my insurance claims background, I'm coming in from that angle as a former loss adjuster myself that has dealt with floods on the Somerset levels, in Harlan, Boscastle and Tewkesbury all those years ago, and Carlisle more recently. And I'd echo everything that Jonathan has said. I think some of the most stressful pinch points in most people's lives, people might resonate with getting married, having a child, moving home, all quite stressful situations, but you can plan for all of those things. So you can mitigate against those stress points. But certainly when I've been in homes with customers who've been flooded, it's the sheer weight of what's next and the devastation. And I think one of the biggest challenges that floods create is long-term or mid-term life disruption, not necessarily just a one-off event. Survivors don't really move on once the water has receded. The flood risk then becomes a constant presence in their daily decision-making, because if you've been flooded once, your mind and the media will tell you that it could happen again. And I guess there's also deep and persistent mental health issues and impacts with flooding. And I've seen that myself with customers. Anxiety, stress, emotional exhaustion can surface immediately, or it can surface much later in, say, a flood claims journey. And on top of that is displacement. It breaks up communities. People lose everyday contact with their closest friends, their neighbours. And some people can feel really isolated and distressed, particularly for children. So if you think about it, you'll be moved somewhere miles away for a long period of time. You've still got to walk the dogs, take the kids to school, get to work. But what really stands out for me is that financial support alone isn't often enough. Social reconnection, clear communication, being heard, feeling heard and understood are in many ways as critical as the recovery or the repair works when our builders go in. So yeah, big impact, I would say.
I think you're right, William. I think it's always true that a lot of disasters have very common characteristics. And I think, Tim, that the thing that we're trying to get behind is what's unique about flood. And if you go back in time, I remember when the ABI, we did the flood review quite a few years ago, in fact, with the Chartered Insurance Institute on a flood review, because I think we'd all just forgotten that repairing damage after a flood takes time, 6 months, 12 months. And I think, as William says, that piece we've learned, what we're now trying to understand is, are there more profound impacts that we need to be aware of? And I think, as you rightly say, fear, probably the main things that we both are talking to.
Yeah, I thought some of the interesting things in the report was the kind of trauma or anxiety after an event as well. Like just when it rains, none of us enjoy the rain and we all moan about it. But some people, that could actually trigger some quite horrible, scary fear. And one of the things I put in this morning is I'm really grateful for my home because it's my stable environment. Your home is that place that's safe. So to lose that must be one of the biggest sort of upheavals. And then I like what you said, Will, about how stressful getting married, moving houses. But like you said, at least you can plan for those. This is something completely different.
I think that comes across very strongly from the work that we've got. And it's about getting it drawn into a report that's been thoughtfully put together that really goes to talk to the people who've been through it and says, well, what was it that really impacted you so that we can all learn a little bit more? And as William says, just take from our understanding to here it is. What can we do about this? How do we learn?
Yeah. And I think that's the really important thing about the report, isn't it? It's all about the human side of it. It's not just data and stats here. This is getting people to really relate to it. It's going to be really impactful, isn't it? So thinking about frontline professionals, so claims handlers, loss adjusters, brokers, and I'll come to you first on this one, Will. What do you think that most of these frontline professionals need to understand about what survivors are going through?
I think the most important thing for us in the insurance sector is recognizing that every claim for flood begins with a personal crisis. Survivors will be traumatized, displaced, possibly overwhelmed, and all of those things will affect their ability to process information or make decisions. Again, going back to what I said earlier, if you think about some of the most stressful points in your life, decision making is really hard when you feel completely overwhelmed. And that is exactly how most major flood insurance customers feel. So frontline professionals, so the people that work for me, need to understand that asking questions that repeatedly relive what's happened to the customer increase that feeling of trauma for them. So they just need to understand that when they're asking those questions. And we shouldn't ever really give unrealistic expectations because that can cause real harm. Just clear, simple, coordinated communication really matters with flood survivors. There's also a practical reality. In crisis situations, many people won't have their documents, access to funds, which Jonathan referenced, or reliable communication. Sometimes right at the start, they can't even find their insurance documents. They might not know where they are, they might not know where to find them. And then you have that level of stress and trauma on top. And it can be really hard just to get in contact with the insurance company if you don't know who they are. So from an insurer's perspective, our systems and our processes need to assume failure conditions rather than ideal ones. So empathy, flexibility, and human judgment, for me, are just as important as technical expertise.
It's interesting the way you describe that, William. Perhaps one of the things that always most surprised me is that telling a story many times is almost certainly going to impact people with trauma. So one of the things I think we have to learn as professionals is to actually either have a single point of contact so that you're not telling the story to lots of different people, or make sure that the information that's gathered is used and then that those who then speak again are briefed to know what the story that's been told is. And I think that's something that I know throughout my career was not always as easy to manage as you wish. And having learned a lot more, as you've described around that, you're very aware how important it is that we record very clearly the story. But you're also sort of caught in this dilemma that the people who we're trying to work with, that those who've been affected, the survivors, are inevitably going to need some guidance. They're disorientated. And if we're going to give the guidance, we may need to give that guidance at several points throughout the claims journey, if we call it that. And people may not know where they are on the claims journey. We might, but we don't always explain it in terms of, here's where we are, this is what we're going to do next. And I think the real sort of tension, William, is that when you've had a major disaster like this strike you, you want some sort of structure, don't you? Your home's been torn apart. So how do we do that in an effective way without constantly asking for the story to be told again? And it's getting that balance right so that we're guiding people, helping each person towards a conclusion, getting a home back, getting sorted in whatever way, shape or form that may be. And in a period of massive dislocation, I think one of the real challenges also is that when one looks at things like flood, it puts pressure on our own claim systems because we've got lots of people that were impacted. So how do we balance speed with making sure that those who deal with the first contact actually know the right things to ask, that they're clear on what's needed, they've got the right empathy, and they're prepared for what they're going to deal with? And I think that remains challenging for all of us. And it's really about just thinking beyond the claims process, saying, here's somebody, this has happened, their home is disrupted, their life's disrupted. How do we help? Mindful that we've got an obligation within the insurance claims process, but let's look wider about how we can think beyond that process and help people look for support more widely if necessary, but be there in the right way and collaborate together.
And I think you both touched on some really great things about showing empathy. And just something made me think about our new generation claims group last year, year before. They produced a report about secondhand trauma, actually, and these claims handlers having to deal with people who are really, really upset, who are distressed and really, really struggling. And, those aren't skills necessarily that typically get taught to a claims handler, but obviously they're becoming more and more important. And obviously there's a lot of work going on about vulnerable customers, which is great. And I think the whole industry is doing a really good job at the moment at sort of looking at how can we be better with vulnerable customers. And I guess as a flood victim, you're a vulnerable customer, aren't you? So it's great. There is a lot of work going on that. It's a big topic and I know it's going to take time, but that's great to see that that's happening. So the report itself then, it sets out there's 5 key ways that flood recovery support could be improved. Jonathan, would you be happy to talk through those and why you think they're so important?
I think the first conclusion is information is support, about having local contact, a very clear checklist and good signposting really help people in going forward. I think you come back to the point they needed, just that structure needed. Your home's been torn apart. Reassurances, having structure. We sometimes forget how important that is to all of us, but just some sense of where next, where we're going, and also perhaps some wider signposting of other contacts in and around who can assist. The financial shock is, without question, immediate. You start having to pay on day one. And I think it's important that we understand that. So the financial shock's there, so needs support, whether that be from the insurance industry or other agencies. So quick access to emergency cash is critical in helping people meet essentials costs and making sure they don't go into debt. And we see some positives around that in the report. But I think for the insurers, it's about getting interim payments moving quickly and being comfortable to provide cash. The way in which the system's put together, we just need to make sure they're simple. They're designed so that survivors have helped inform us in what's needed. And so we have to make sure we think about each person as an individual. Every person we deal with is an individual. Everybody's unique. And the better that we can understand that and make sure that our recovery programs work for those individuals. And William's already touched on that around vulnerable people and the need to understand what individuals particularly need. Mental health, as we know, is often overlooked, and we've talked a little bit about that already. And I think, Tim, it's interesting, as you say, when you refer to that New Gen report, because I think we've often not thought about the mental health is both with those who are affected directly by a disaster and are struggling with dealing with the aftermath of that, but also those who we ask to look at the claims themselves and our own claims teams and how do we support them in those moments. So I think we just need to make sure that we think about how mental health is embedded in recovery from the outset. And we're starting to see some initiatives around that. And I think the last thing that really surprised me, I've really started to learn much more about, is how important communities are, about how communities can work together. They're often under-resourced, but volunteers, local action groups, little informal networks all need to be helped so that we can create a more resilient recovery, but also in longer term, more resilience. And I think that was, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of this report, because we've seen it as we go to Cumbria after floods. We've seen it as we've been around the country and other parts of the world, in my own case. It's about rebuilding lives. That's not always easy when we're moving people to alternative accommodation, we're relocating. But the more that we can help people return to their community and that communities can be rebuilt, I think the stronger it is. But those are some of the main features of the report.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. Did you want to add anything there, Will, at all?
I think Jonathan's covered it really well, but I think of all of the fantastic points that Jonathan has made, certainly from an insurance perspective, on the insurer side, that the most important one at the front end is the access to cash. Financial distress is a key feature of vulnerability. We find a lot of our customers are, not necessarily in flood claims, are vulnerable because of a financial circumstance. And so access right at the front end. So people can buy clothes, can buy what feel like the simple things in life, buying clothes, being able to afford formula for your baby, being able to replace some of your work items so that you can work safely and securely and so on and so forth are absolutely critical. So just agree with everything that Jonathan said there.
I've been working on a project elsewhere in the world, and one of the big things that we looked at was getting an insurance village on site almost immediately after a major disaster, with the ability to move cash to people within that area, but using all the sort of technology that's available to us now from satellites and other such, just to say, well, we know we've got a problem. It's unlikely these are going to cost less than X amount. Let's move some money to people, just to start that rolling. And I think we saw that ability to put people on the ground with the ability to move money is very, very important, William. I think that's absolutely spot on.
Yeah, and insurers back in the day when I started my career in the late 90s and I was dealing with floods and I was employed by another major UK insurer, they used to have like floodmobiles. I think AXA had one, RSA had one. I was at RSA at the time, and you could almost go to a local community and have experts on hand, just able to help the kind of things that Jonathan references. And it's kind of fallen away in the last decade or so across the industry. But what we've seen in that same time is way more floods in terms of severity and frequency. And we just see them every year upon year upon year. So that local community support mechanism is vital.
Just putting out a couple of the stats in the report, my next question. So 69% experience mental health issues, only 33% receive mental health support. So thinking about trauma, stress, displacement, how that affects people's ability to then deal with the claims process. Thinking about that 33%, what support is already in place today that is working and maybe we can try and emulate more of?
As a judge of the British Insurance Awards, I've heard a little bit recently about quite a lot of the work that's going on around realizing how important it is to understand that there is a deep mental health impact for anyone who's affected by this type of horrific disaster. And the training and the awareness, I think, is there. And I think that's teaching us a lot more about how we speak and how we engage and the type of language. I remember early on in my career, we used to talk about people's houses. Nobody lives in a house, you live in a home. But I think it probably goes a little bit deeper than that. Local resilience forums, local community foundations, local charities are all there to provide support. So one of the projects that we're working on from the National Emergencies Trust is a data map, so that when there is a disaster in an area, we're piloting it at the moment and testing it, probably will be live later this year, we hope so. But it allows you to see what other sources of support are available so that people who are in need of support can turn to that. And a lot of the mental health issues come from feeling alone, from the disruption, from the fear. And the more that one can start to address that locally in the community, then I think the more likely one can help people through that very, very difficult period. But William, I know as a judge that a lot of what's going on in that area.
Yeah, I think people can become vulnerable through a claim. Vulnerability is something that as an industry, we have got a lot better at identifying and providing a better level of care than we did previously. But I think it's important to recognize that these claims are very long. They can be months, sometimes years, regrettably. And you can become vulnerable. So we've mentioned financial vulnerability, but you can become financially vulnerable. But a good example of one that I've seen recently is a customer on a flood claim became vulnerable because they went through a breakup. So they were both insured and then they split up and went their separate ways. Through that claim, that made them vulnerable. And I'm not sure previously in yesteryear that staff in the industry would have necessarily been able to identify those examples as vulnerability. So there's a lot of talk of the use of data and AI, and certainly a lot through the CII, but where we have been able to improve our identification and therefore our support for vulnerable customers, and a good chunk of people will be vulnerable because of their flood claims, is through the use of data and AI. So those initial first few phone calls with F&O handlers and using AI to pick up on little snippets of information that's provided to inform the claims handler or the staff that the customer may be exhibiting signs of vulnerability. So the identification is absolutely critical. That's the most important part, is to identify the vulnerability and then provide the level of care. But certainly something that has developed in recent years is an almost concierge service on top of a normal service, particularly in the field with loss adjusters and surveyors and claims management companies, and identifying those customers that just need that extra level of care and support. But it goes back to a point that Jonathan made at the beginning of this podcast, which is one single sole person that you can go to and communicate with. So lots is happening. I would say that it's challenging for claims staff. I certainly know, and you've heard me mention this before, Tim, that when I started as a loss adjuster at 20 or 21, I owned my own home. So I was already gaining practical life skills from being a homeowner, being a father, and the emotional side of homeowning. And the 21-year-old me now probably doesn't own their own home, as an example. So to a degree, I think that claims staff in our industry, the younger ones, or people coming into the industry, will have a different set of life skills we never had, but understanding home ownership, building pathology, and all of the anxiety and trauma that can go with losing that is something that has changed in our industry in recent times. So training staff, making staff have got the right levels of support is vital. But then one final point on this. Sometimes managing a claim for a flood customer or survivor can become traumatic for claim staff, really, really traumatic. And that's something that I know that the industry are starting to observe and ensuring that they can provide the right level of care, comfort and support to claim staff to manage customers through these traumatic events. So there is a lot that's happening, but there's probably a bit more that can be done as well.
I think it's interesting the way you describe it with him. I mean, fundamentally, Tim, I think the point is that we sometimes look so hard at the area of financial aid and trying to rebuild and some of those things, and we fail to spot the psychological aspects that are going on. And for most people, that's around being able to get some form of counselling, some form of support that's local, some form of community network, but something so that you're not alone. I think the thing that comes across very powerfully is how many people feel very alone in these circumstances. There's been a major disruption and that feeling of isolation. So it's about, I think, building some appreciation that the psychological aspects are not going to go away, and they may develop, as William described, in different ways, so that, again, you're back at looking at individuals and tuning into each person in the right way, but also signposting what other support is available, preferably in the local community, because that's where people want to look to get themselves into that community feeling again. That seems to be a very strong survival element of this, as we've heard in the report.
I think also, Tim, trauma and stress and anxiety, they reduce people's cognitive capacity. So people that have experienced floods may struggle, just as an example, to track information, remember conversations, understand next steps. And all of those things are heightened or exacerbated when somebody's displaced from their home. So there is support in place today, and I've referenced vulnerability frameworks, Jonathan referenced interim payments, and I've referenced specialist teams. But the report that's been commissioned shows that these support networks don't always reach people at the right time or in the right way. So that's where there's an opportunity for the industry to be a bit more proactive. As I said earlier, recognizing vulnerability early, reducing the need for people to repeat their story, which Jonathan's referenced, but tailoring communication channels so the human, the person comes first with the digital support later.
Looking ahead then, what could and what should insurers and insurance professionals be focusing on most when it comes to supporting flood survivors?
I think from this side of the industry or the fence, again, in this data-driven, AI-led world, and the insurance industry is on a major charge with how we use data to drive consumer trends and how we manage customer impacts and outcomes. But perhaps insurers or the industry need to understand whether they move or consider moving away from purely volume-based event triggers, so in reactive, and maybe ensuring that the root and branch of their claims functions incorporate vulnerability, infrastructure impact, and accessibility into how insurers respond. I guess there's also a need to design systems assuming disruption. So having those systems in place that assume that. And I've referenced missing documents, and there's things like power outages and communication failures. But critically, the industry do need to invest in people and support claims professionals so that, and I've referenced this previously, they don't experience burnout or compassion fatigue almost. When I was a young adjuster and surveyor dealing with the tragic floods in Tewkesbury, Harlem, Boscastle, and I probably did suffer some compassion fatigue during those events and crises because it became my norm. And so you almost become conditioned to it. So I guess ultimately for insurers, it's about balancing speed and expertise, but also with efficiency and vitally with dignity for people.
I think that's well explained, William. The piece I think that we occasionally forget, it's a very simple thing, which I said earlier. Very few people get up in the morning thinking, I must have an insurance claim today. It's not a thing that's planned, and we've talked quite a lot about that. And I think that perhaps one of the most profound things is to understand that this is not a planned event. So for flood survivors, not only was this not a planned event, but it's an event that may recur. So there will always be that fear. So it is that ability, I think, to tune in, somebody to speak with, having a local point of contact or one point of contact, as we've already said. Some of our supply chain initiatives in the insurance industry have seen, up to 17 people knock on your front door. And that's going to be confusing. That what we need is just a simple checklist of recovery and an ability to remember that, as William has described, not everybody remembers everything that was agreed. That communicate clearly, communicate in a way that works for the survivor, works for the claimant, works for the policyholder. And sometimes we all fall for this, that we force people down our chosen communication route rather than theirs. And I think the more we can think about simple things like that, then the better we'll do. The report's positive about what we do, but there are always chances to improve and there's chances to learn, and we take those chances.
So pulling out another stat from the report, 1 in 4 homes could be at risk of flooding in future. So a quarter, basically. I don't know how long-term that is, but obviously I assume that's linked to things like climate change and construction. So this is my final question, really, and we can finish on a positive. So what could flood recovery look like in 5 or 10 years then, Jonathan and Will? You come to you as well on that one.
Well, I think the first thing I'd say, and I think William's already spoken to this, and I agree entirely, that we shouldn't manage our responses to major incidents just by saying, oh, well, it's X thousand homes affected. We need to build a multi-agency response where we as the insurance industry, we collaborate together, but where we're part of working with the community foundations, local resilience, community networks and others to actually come into a community and say, how can we rebuild? How can we make this work better for you? And I think that the key thing that we've got to get used to asking is what's really going on here? Sometimes we say, well, we know what it is. It's a flood. But actually, what's really going on here? What's really been impacted? And I think the better we can get at that, building ground truths so that we actually know what we're looking at and we start to share that together, work with local volunteers. And I think above all else, just start to help people manage the changes that have impacted them in a positive way with rebuilding and getting people back in their homes in the right way with early funding available. So in many respects, much of what we're doing now, but I think recognizing some of the challenges around mental health and some of the other challenges that we've tried to highlight in this report and talking to survivors.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, it could feel fundamentally different in the future. Some of the points that we've discussed today would suggest that survivors could experience faster, clearer, and critically more compassionate support. Claims will always be technical. Flood claims will always be highly technical. But I think there's an opportunity to design them a little more around the human needs rather than administrative convenience. Stronger cross-sector industry collaboration would improve and better community resilience, and probably there'd be fewer repeat losses through smarter reinstatement. And if I think about Build Back Better, the flood reback scheme, there are opportunities for that scheme to develop, which would significantly contribute to reducing repeat flood experiences for homeowners. But I think most importantly, people need to feel supported. They need to feel not processed or part of a process. And I think that would be a really powerful shift for the profession.
I'm just going to pick up one of the things you said there, William, because I think also just looking ahead, we need to look hard again at the challenges of our claims profession because they do have to have those technical skills, but it's about their ability to translate those technical skills into real life actions and real life support for survivors of what are disasters that are impacting them in ways that we can understand, but we need to understand better and tune in better. And I think from time to time, we've struggled with that. But we do have a generation of claims professionals who are well-trained technically, but it's about how do you apply that technical skill. And we're not there to have a technical conversation with somebody. We're there to help guide them to recovery. And I think that's something that, William, I absolutely agree with.
Absolutely. I think good support to these survivors would probably feel like calm, clear, human, and joined up, reduction of uncertainty rather than added to it, and a recognition that recovery is as much about emotional and social support as it is about financial support.
I think those are really important points there, aren't they? Is that it's no single organization's responsibility. It's not, or profession's responsibility. It's a whole societal thing that leads people on the ground. It needs the insurance companies, local authorities and so forth all to come together to work this. And I think reports like this and the discussions that we're having today are so important. And they're just a really good example of how progression is happening. The fact we're talking about mental health, vulnerable customers, we wouldn't have been doing that probably 10 years ago. So thank you both for joining us today. And look forward to maybe speaking to you again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much for an open and thoughtful discussion today. And thank you to everyone for listening. If today's conversation has sparked any thoughts or reflections for you, you can find helpful links and related resources in the show notes, along with more articles and podcast episodes on the Journal website. If you found this particular episode useful, please do follow or subscribe and consider leaving a quick review. It really helps more people in the profession to find these conversations. Thank you again for spending your time with us, and we'll see you again on the next episode.